we have had a lot of Joe Lundeen this morning. Now, I'm not going to lie. With Joel not here and me preaching, I'm thinking like I'm kind of in charge of some things, right? Feeling a little good about myself. And then during the children's sermon, Mr. Joe taking off his tie, and I'm like, okay. And he's taking off his jacket, I'm like, okay. And then he started fiddling. I was like, okay, oh no. Got a little worried there. Thought we might have to exercise some church discipline for a second. Things you can't do in the sanctuary. But I really am just so thankful to have this opportunity. Joe lets me preach a lot, but I still feel like it's not enough. One thing that I love to do, because I don't go through series whenever I preach, because it's not every week, it's kind of sporadic, is I really like taking a passage, a text that used to confuse me when I was younger, when I was first studying it, and really focus and try to figure out why was it so odd to me. And so the passage this morning that I'd like us to focus on is Luke chapter 17. Luke chapter 17, starting in verse 11. It says, "On the way to Jerusalem, he," being Jesus, "was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance and lifted up their voices, saying, 'Jesus, Master, have mercy on us.' And when he saw them, he said to them, 'Go and show yourselves to the priests.' And they went, and they were cleansed. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. And he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered, 'Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?' And he said to him, 'Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well.'" Now the reason why this passage confused me, bothered me, is because I just kept thinking to myself, why in the world would you not thank Jesus for what he had just done for you? Why in the world would only 1 out of the 10 even bother to turn around and thank him? I just kept thinking to myself, how ungrateful can you be? Didn't make any sense. Confused me. Now, a lot of times when we come upon a passage such as this one, we'll make some assumptions. Make some assumptions about what the passage means, and we tend to overlook certain truths. So, for instance, one assumption that someone might make when reading this passage is, well, this passage is all about being thankful. And the lesson we're supposed to learn from it is to be thankful for everything God has done. So the assumption is, well, it's just polite to say thank you. And they weren't thankful. We should be thankful. And when we do that, what we're really doing, whether we know it or not, is we are changing what the text says. We are taking away and adding stuff in. Similar to what Joel said last week about when we don't have significant biblical knowledge, what happens is we end up inadvertently, unintentionally taking some things and adding them. And when we simplify this passage to simply mean be thankful for God, my question then is, well, how come the passage wasn't Jesus walked into a village and there was 10 people with 10 busted hands, and Jesus healed 10 hands and only one turned around and said thank you, and we'd go, well, yeah, it makes sense for thankfulness. Or it could have been that there's 10 paralyzed men, and Jesus healed the 10 paralyzed men and only one turned around and said thank you. But throughout all of Scripture, what we see is that no matter what kind of healing Jesus is doing, when he heals someone, they will immediately stand up and thank him. Regardless of what feedback from the community would be, regardless of what the scribes and the Pharisees would tell them, regardless if they thought that they were going to get in trouble because they happened to be healed on the Sabbath, regardless, they would always thank Jesus. But for some reason on this day, 9 out of the 10 decided not to thank Jesus. And so we can't just make the assumption that maybe this whole passage is simply about being thankful and saying thank you to God, because it gives some details that don't seem to add up. If that was the case, why were there 10 people that Jesus healed? Why not just one who was unthankful and Jesus said, you should give thanks? The second assumption is what we might do is we might zone in on one specific detail and we'll just kind of run with it and ignore the rest of what it says. And the temptation here is to look at where it says that person who came back and thanked him was a Samaritan. And we'll think, oh, well, this all has to do with Samaritans. It has to do with almost kind of racism. And we'll say the Samaritan was the good one because they always are. The woman at the well, the good Samaritan. We might be thinking it's just saying that Samaritans were more thankful for Jesus than Jewish people. And my response to that is, well, no, because Jesus was a Jew, and all of his disciples were Jewish, and the thousands of people following him around were mostly Jewish, so that doesn't make a lot of sense to me either. So, why in the world would 9 out of the 10, not come back and thank Jesus after being healed? It bothered me, and it confused me, and I get irritated when I don't know something. Miss Polly knows what I'm talking about. So let's think. If I was actually alive back then, if I was one of the lepers, have leprosy, why in the world would I not thank Jesus? So let me just put myself in that mindset. First of all, if I have leprosy, the first thing I need to understand is that I'm going to die. Because leprosy has no cure. And it wasn't a quick death either. It's over the course of years and years and years. I wouldn't know when, but I would know that eventually leprosy would kill me. It's the first thing that would always be in my head, that I'm going to die. And then the second thing that I know is true about leprosy is that it meant that I was unclean. And we can see this in the Bible, in Leviticus chapter 13. You don't have to turn there, but in chapter 13, starting in verse 14, the law speaks about skin disease and leprosy, and it says, "But when raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean, and the priest shall examine the raw flesh and pronounce him unclean. Raw flesh is unclean, for it is a leprous disease." Now, for those of you who don't know exactly what leprosy is, let me tell you briefly, essentially what it is. It is a skin disease that is so bad, it's an infection that gets so widespread that parts of your skin start to die. And as they begin to die, even worse infections take in until eventually that raw flesh is so dead and so poisoned that it falls off. So if you have leprosy, you know that eventually some of your fingers, your toes, your nose, your ears, chunks would fall off and it would eventually kill you. It was a horrific, awful disease, and because there's that raw flesh, and because it is so contagious, from the moment you were diagnosed with leprosy, you were unclean. We'll go into a few details about that right now, but what we need to understand from that mindset of that person who has leprosy is the first thought is, I'm definitely going to die of this. And their second thought is, I am unclean. The third thought is that if you have leprosy, and we see this in Leviticus 13 and in verse 45, it talks more about the command from God for someone with leprosy. Verse 45, the leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside of the camp. If you had leprosy, you weren't even allowed to live in the same area as everyone else. You had to wear certain clothes, a certain garment, and you had to wear a certain a facial structure where the cloth would cover your upper lip and your nose because they knew it was contagious, but they'd be able to see the baldness on your head because your hair would be some of the first stuff to go. And so that from a long distance, people would be able to spot you and say, that person has leprosy. I need to keep a safe distance from that person. So if you have leprosy and you're walking down the road and there's other people coming along, and not only would they go to the other side of the road, but they'd probably go a little bit farther. They'd want to make sure they don't get anywhere near that person with leprosy because it is dangerous, it is contagious, it is a death sentence. And so those 10 people with leprosy, what we need to understand about them is, number one, they knew that they were going to die of leprosy. They knew there was no cure. Number two, they knew that from the moment they had it, they would always be unclean. There would never be a moment where they could be clean. What this means is they couldn't come to church. They couldn't go into the temple. They couldn't hang out with these good church folks. They couldn't share a meal. They couldn't drink the same drink. They couldn't do anything. Not only that, they had to wear certain clothes. They had to live outside the camp. It's the one thing that was most important if you had leprosy. The one thing that the Jewish nation wanted to make sure was done was they wanted to make sure that leprosy was not spread to anyone else for any reason, because it was dangerous. And so having that said, my mindset for someone who has leprosy, if I'm one of the 10 people and I have leprosy and I know I'm going to die, and I know I'm isolated from society, and I know I'm unclean, so I know that I can't do anything. I can't get married, I can't have kids, I can't have a job, I'm on the street begging for food. Anything I touch, people are like, oh, no, I can't touch that because it's unclean. People don't want to walk on the same side of the street. People look from afar off, and I have to tell them, unclean, unclean, don't come near me if I'm living like that. And then one day I meet Jesus, and He heals me. I now have a choice to make. I have a very important choice to make. Option one is I can go back and I can thank Jesus. I can go back to all the crowds of people, the hundreds that are following Jesus at this point in His ministry. I can go back to them, gather around, and declare to them, I used to be a leper. And then I would be known as the man who had leprosy for the rest of my life. And although they would say, it's so wonderful what Jesus did to you, they'd always be thinking in the back of their mind, you know, that guy had leprosy, and I've been told since I was a young man that you can't actually be cured of leprosy, and we always need to be on the watch for that guy with leprosy. And so I can just imagine them sitting around at a big table sharing a meal, and do you really want to share a meal with a person who just had leprosy? If they're eating a bite, they're like, here, do you want to try a bite of this? Are you really going to take a bite? You're like, no, thank you, that's fine. If the person with leprosy comes up and wants to give you a hug, are you going to hug them or are you going to be like, oh, that's okay? And they'd say over and over, no, I've been cured of my leprosy. And you're like, yeah, I know, but sometimes better safe than sorry. If you're trying to get a job and you're known as the man who once had leprosy, would you want to hire the person who has leprosy? Knowing that if you catch it, it's a death sentence. It's highly contagious. There's all these laws. And he'd say, no, but I've been cured of my leprosy. If you had a daughter, would you want your daughter to marry the man who had leprosy? How comfortable would you feel about that? And so these 10 individuals with leprosy had a choice to make. Option one is to go back and thank Jesus and forever be known as the man who had leprosy. Option two is to never go back and try to hide that part of their past. Wear clothes that would cover up all the scars. Go to an area where no one has known them and never talk about that time in your life where you once had leprosy. Hide that part. The reason why 9 out of the 10 did not come back and thank Jesus is not because they were ungrateful. To say that they were ungrateful is crazy because their lives had just been saved. But what they were, well, they were full of shame. And they desperately did not want anyone to know that they had leprosy, that they were once unclean. That shame went with them. You see, the guilt, the sin, the disease itself were completely cleansed by Jesus, but that shame remained. Despite what Jesus did, despite meeting him, that shame of the disease remained. See, shame is much different from guilt, but here in our nation, our society, and our culture, we tend to kind of just lump them both together. We don't do a good job distinguishing the difference between shame and guilt. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to look a little bit about where shame comes from, what it actually means, and we're going to figure out how it applies to us. You see, shame is a direct result of sin. There was no such thing as shame until the fall. As a matter of fact, shame was the first result of sin ever seen from the fall. And we don't have time to turn there, but if you remember Adam and Eve, they ate the fruit and their eyes were open, and the first thing that they did as they're looking at each other as man and wife is they realized that they were both naked. And the Bible says they felt what? Ashamed. So what did they do? They made clothes. They covered themselves. So the very first thing that happened, the second the fall happened, it didn't say they were overcome by this massive guilt. It does not say they're overcome by the pain of the thorns they were walking on, the heat of the day. It doesn't say any of that. It says the very first thing that happened was they felt this overwhelming amount of shame. And they immediately tried to cover up that shame as quick as possible. So the first thing that they did was they hid from each other by making clothes. The first thing Adam and Eve did, the first result of sin. The second thing that they did was they hid from God. It says that God was walking in the garden, calling out to him, and Adam and Eve were hiding from God. The second thing that shame did, when shame first came, is they immediately wanted to not only hide from themselves, but the second thing, they wanted to hide from God. And then there's the third thing they did. See, the next thing that happened was God questioned them about what was happening, about what had transpired. And this is, of course, where Adam says, it's not my fault, it's Eve's fault. And Eve says, it wasn't my fault, it was the serpent's fault. You know what they're actually doing? They're editing their past. They're lying about their past. They're trying to justify what had happened. Adam's saying, no, you don't understand. See, I didn't really sin. It was Eve. It was Eve. And Eve said, no, you don't really understand. It wasn't my fault. It was the serpent. It was the serpent. The first thing that shame does is it makes us want to hide from each other. The second thing that shame does, it makes us want to hide from God. The third thing that shame does is it makes us lie about our past. It makes us edit certain things so that it would seem less shameful. We try to justify our actions and what had happened. And we see that the lepers did the exact same thing. They were cleansed from this awful disease, this leprosy. They're no longer guilty. They're no longer going to die, but they felt this shame. So the first thing they did was, they wanted to hide from others, right? I don't want to go back, and everyone will know me as the man who had leprosy, and there's shame in that. Second thing, I can't go back to Jesus. Talk about literally hiding from God. Jesus heals you and you walk away. And the third thing they did is they tried to edit their past. Because they didn't want to be known as that person who always had leprosy. You go somewhere and be unknown. We see the lepers did the exact same thing. And you might be thinking at this point, well, that was a great little sermon. Hopefully you're thinking that. Probably thinking that's wonderful. I feel like I understand that story. There you go. See, recording, it's good stuff. I'll tell you, that's because in the Bible, when something was powerful, God would repeat it several times, and that's all that's happening right now. They always immediately we have marriage counseling. We need some advice. What it should be, but because they have no idea that other people have gone through rough patches as well, they feel like their marriage is broken. And they feel like they're going through something that no one else has to because of the shame of admitting that your marriage isn't always 100% perfect. Most often, how marriage counseling starts is they'll come to the office and they'll say something similar to, I think we're getting a divorce. We have to do over several hours is convince them that that is not the right option. And it's because, even though every church is full of marriages, and every marriage has rough spots, every marriage needs work, it needs maintenance. It's not always perfect. There's trials. But we can't talk about that in the church. Mothers, the second thing is just like the lepers, just like Adam and Eve, we also like to hide from God. You know, it's amazing. Every time, well, it doesn't matter where I am, every prayer list is remarkably the same. Everyone I've ever seen. Every single prayer list is full of people who are sick. Every single one of them. It's like over 90% of all the prayer, even from the youth, if I'm asking them, do we have any prayer requests? They're immediately racking their brain. Do I know anyone who is recently in a car accident? Do I know anyone who is sick? Wise, because if you say that someone is sick, there's absolutely no shame in saying that, because everyone gets sick, and it's not their fault. So here on these prayer request lists, all we have is a bunch of health problems. And instead of our prayers being filled with what we're actually going through, we're just listing out diseases and illnesses and accidents. You know, I look through the biblical accounts of prayers, and it is very difficult to see someone praying a list of illnesses. I say it's difficult because it's not in there. At no point in the Bible does anyone sit down and say, I have got to pray right now. I need to list out everyone I know who's sick. It just doesn't happen. What we do see in the Bible is prayers full of finance problems. Prayers full of conflict, of personal anger, of child raising, of cussing. Sinner, and this is what I need help with. We've been talking a lot about prayer and fasting the last few weeks at the church. It's the next kind of big push we're doing. We had a few months talking about biblical literacy, every single sermon, in and out, because we wanted to make it very clear right off the bat the most important thing for any Christian is to understand what the Bible says. It is our foundation. The second thing that we're really working on is this idea that prayer and fasting should be a natural when all we're doing is listing out things that don't bring any kind of share with. We don't dare list them at the church. What would it look like if we had a prayer request list and instead of just being filled with illnesses and diseases, it was filled with the problems that we hear about day in, day out at the church office? I just can't get along with my new boss. And he's this young guy, and he thinks he knows what he's talking about, but I know he's wrong. And I'm just filled with anger towards him. Maybe a young couple dealing with fertility issues and problems. Oh, that's what they need prayer about. About a young man who's dealing with lust, issues with pornography. Oh, we can't list that out in the Wednesday night prayer meeting. Be a scandal, wouldn't it? But these are the things that people actually are going through. These are the things that actually matter. And these are the things that we don't dare mention in church because they are shameful. And heaven forbid, the church knows that I once had leprosy. The third thing that shame does is it causes us to lie about our past. It causes us to justify our actions. I've heard over the course of my life probably literally thousands of testimonies. Thousands and thousands of testimonies. And I'm here to tell you that some testimonies I hear and I think to myself, that is a powerful testimony. And there's other testimonies I hear and I think to myself, that was not as powerful. We don't like to say that, but the truth is if we have a guest speaker that comes to the church and they say, I used to be a drug user, a drug dealer. I spent years in jail, and then I got saved, and I turned my life around, and look at me now, and we're like, yes, it's amazing. We think that's a powerful testimony. What a gift God has given you by giving you that powerful testimony. And then we have other testimonies. This is what I hear for most testimonies. Most testimonies is, well, I was a young man. I got saved. Before I was saved, I did some wrong things, but I wasn't a bad person. I didn't do anything like really bad. But then I got saved because I was going to church and I was raised in church, and here I am now. And I think to myself when I hear that testimony, honestly, I think to myself, so what you're saying is meeting Jesus Christ didn't change your life at all. Because you're saying before you met Jesus Christ, you were a good kid who went to church. And then after you met Jesus Christ, you were still a good kid who went to church. And I think to myself, well, it seems like Jesus didn't do much for you, did he? Imagine the testimony of some of those lepers that didn't come back to thank Jesus, who didn't admit that they had leprosy. Imagine their testimony years after the fact. After Jesus had already died on the cross, rose again, the church is ascending, and they have a testimony. They have a story they want to tell people about when they met Jesus. I'm like, I remember the day I met Jesus. I met him, and it was amazing, and I was healed. What were you healed from? Well, I didn't have any, it wasn't anything serious, I promise. But yeah, he healed me, and it was good. A seminary professor once told me, we cannot make ourselves seem righteous and Jesus glorious at the same time. The older I get, the more I realize how much wisdom is in those words. What we do when we refuse to admit our sin and our shame is we are lying about what Jesus has done for us and done in us. We are editing our past, and when we do, we make Jesus look weak and ineffective at doing anything. You see, I don't believe there's any such thing as a weak testimony. I believe that every time Jesus Christ gets a hold of someone, They give their life to him. It gives them a new heart, makes them a new creation. I believe that is a powerful thing. What I also believe, though, is that sometimes we lie about the details because we are ashamed of our past. We're ashamed of what we actually were. And heaven forbid anyone in the church knows we used to have leprosy. I think about some of the most powerful testimonies in the Bible, and the one thing they always had in common is they were always completely open about the shame that was in their past. You think of the Apostle Paul, who wrote a majority of the New Testament. What did he say about his past over and over and over? He said he was the chief among sinners. He was the guy who killed Christians. At no point does he ever say, well, I wasn't that bad of a person. I promise it wasn't anything big, but yeah, I met Jesus and it was good. No. I think about David a lot, King David. You know, I always used to wonder, why in the world does God say that this is a man after his own heart when I look at some of the things that he did through his life? I mean, you think about it. He had an affair. He orchestrated for the husband to be killed. I'm willing to say that if you are an adulteress and a murderer, you're not allowed to be a deacon here at the church. I'm willing to put my stamp down saying, if we really had someone come up and say, I committed adultery and then I murdered her husband so I could marry her. Well, first we'd be calling the cops. Jordan would be on speed dial. That's what we'd do. So how in the world can the Bible consistently say that David was a man after his own heart? Well, it's very simple. Because after this sin, during this repentance, David made a big show to all of Israel. And all of Israel knew what he did. All of Israel knew what had happened. And all of Israel saw how God took a hold of his heart and made him a different man after that fact. David was not ashamed of his past. He let go of that consequence of sin. And because of that, at the end of his life, God calls him a man after his own heart. There's a famous verse that's often taken out of context. And it's a verse you've all heard probably 100 times before. It's Paul saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is God's power unto salvation. And we'll sit there and we'll think, well, of course I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why would I be ashamed of anything the Bible says? Why would I be ashamed of Jesus? That's not what Paul's talking about. When he says I'm not ashamed of the gospel, he's saying I'm not ashamed of what the gospel has done in my life. Because he doesn't believe in editing his past. I often think to myself, what would this church look like if shame did not have a part in what we did? And I'm here to tell you right now that I have big problems and issues with shame. Especially as someone on staff, I absolutely hate admitting when I'm wrong. And I hate admitting when I'm sinful. And I hate admitting when I'm weak. Because in the back of my mind, I think if the church knows what an awful sinner I am, there's no way they'd want me to stay here. Shame is something that we all deal with. Shame always causes three things. It causes us to hide from each other, to hide from God, and to lie about our past. And until we as a church are able to tackle this issue of shame and put it behind us, I'm here to tell you our testimony and our outreach will always be hindered because people will say, what a bunch of hypocrites those people in the church are. I know they sin, but they don't admit it. Our prayers will be hindered because God is wanting us to pray about the things we're actually dealing with, but we're only wanting to pray about the stuff that makes us look real righteous. And our testimony will always be hindered because it will always seem so weak when we edit it down to where it seems like meeting Jesus Christ and being saved had little to no impact in our lives at all. Where we say, well, I was a good church kid before I was saved, and I was a good church kid after I was saved. My question then is, well, then what did Jesus do for you?